All right, let's take a look at another indirect proof, or specifically one by contradiction. And this one's a little bit different than our previous. So we're given a scenario. On a certain island, each inhabitant always lies or always tells the truth. And we have two players here. We have Calvin and Phoebe. Calvin and Phoebe live on this island. Calvin says, exactly one of us is lying. Phoebe says, Calvin is telling the truth. Our job is to prove who is telling the truth and who is lying. All right, so here we go. If we're going to try and do this, and again, because we're saying that we should try and prove this by perhaps a contradiction, let's assume, say that Calvin, in this particular assumption, is a truth teller. So let's assume Calvin is a truth teller. If Calvin is a truth teller, then his statement, exactly one of us is lying. Let's examine that and see what happens. So if exactly one of us is lying, and we've assumed that Calvin is a truth teller, then that means that Phoebe must be the liar. But Phoebe says Calvin is telling the truth. If Phoebe is a liar, then that statement must be false. So if what's the opposite of telling the truth? That is that Calvin is not a truth teller. So to me, what we line up with is we have a contradiction here. So for me to say that we have a contradiction, we have to go back to our first assumption, and the assumption was that Calvin was a truth teller. Well, so then we have to assume that Calvin is not a truth teller. So we know right now Calvin is not a truth teller. Now let's see if we can figure out whether Phoebe is or not. So we can now say that with all degree of certainty that Calvin is not a truth teller. But if Calvin is not a truth teller, let's go back and examine this statement of his that said exactly one of us is lying. What's the opposite of exactly one of us is lying? Well, there are actually two scenarios. So scenario one is that, well, we could have both are truth tellers. Well, we know that's not possible because we already determined that Calvin is not a truth teller. So scenario one was going to maybe help us to understand that both Phoebe and Calvin were truth tellers, but we've already determined or ascertained that Calvin is not a truth teller. Scenario two is a little bit more interesting. In that scenario two, it says exactly one of us is lying. Well, we could have both lying. And well, if Calvin is lying, we already know that, but let's examine if Phoebe is lying. If Phoebe is lying, then that means that Calvin isn't telling the truth, and that we've already determined, so we can in fact determine that Phoebe is also not a truth teller. Sometimes this stuff with proofs by contradiction can be a little confusing, but I figured I'd give you one more scenario that wasn't so mathematical just to try and wrap your head around. I hope that helps, and we'll talk soon.